Hello, and welcome to Betterbee's Seasons of Beekeeping Summer webinar. This is our opportunity to share tips and tricks and information with you that will hopefully make you and your bees happy, healthy, and productive all summer long. So I'll just introduce myself first. My name is David Peck. I'm Betterbee's Director of Research and Education. I'm the staff scientist here. I got my PhD at Cornell studying honeybee behavior under Professor Tom Seeley, and I also studied Varroa mite behavior and the behavioral interactions between parasites and mites. So in my role here at Betterbee, I write articles, I create and edit YouTube videos, I teach classes, and I teach all over the country, giving lectures to bee clubs, either via Zoom or traveling. And I make sure that the information that Betterbee puts out to you is going to be accurate and is also going to be helpful and easy to understand. That's at least my goal. Now, this is a re-recording of our live Zoom webinar. Unfortunately, the webinar went really well, but the recording did not function. So we've had to re-record it so that we had something to put up on YouTube for the folks that couldn't join us live. Therefore, there's not going to be a live Q&A at the end because I'm the only person in this Zoom recording right now. But if you have any questions, please feel free, throw them in the YouTube comments, and we will see them and do our best to answer them as they come in. So, we're talking about summer beekeeping, but what are your bees doing right now? Hopefully you're not watching this in the middle of the summer. You're watching this in the middle to late spring so that you can get your bees ready for a productive summer. Well, if you have bees that you've just purchased and installed, then those bees are still growing. They're going to need some support from you. They're going to need to build out and establish themselves in their new hives. If you already have an established colony that overwintered, they're going to go through their spring buildup phase as well. And swarming is going to be a major concern because those overwintered colonies are going to be looking for the first opportunity to go through their reproductive process, which is to say, swarm. So spring in beekeeping is fundamentally all about growth. Colonies, whether they're brand new or are overwintered, are going to be smaller than they'd like to be in order to productively forage all through the summer. And so they're going to grow during the spring. We help the bees do that by fueling them with supplemental nutrition. Sugar syrup that we might add to the colony, especially if you're asking a colony to build comb for you, a little supplemental sugar can go a long way. And if you need to make more bees in your colony, if they're particularly weak or if you're planning to split them later on, giving them a protein supplement, a pollen patty or something like that, can be a really helpful way to boost the population. That being said, you don't always need to give your bees a protein supplement. There's plenty of pollen out in nature in most places, and so the bees may not need that extra boost unless you feel like they're falling behind. And of course, we need to give our bees plenty of space to grow. New bees need to grow into and occupy their new hive, and established colonies, if they don't have enough space, are going to start feeling crowded and getting ready to swarm. Well, you do need to be aware also in spring that sometimes some days and nights are cooler than others. And so beekeepers sometimes panic and think, oh, how can my bees possibly deal with a 35-degree day when it was 70 degrees yesterday? And the answer is generally bees are pretty darn good at that. Remember, they can survive sub-zero temperatures during the winter, so they can revert back to those behaviors on a chilly spring day as well. You do want to be mindful, though, if you have a long period of cold weather, not to give your bees liquid sugar syrup because they can struggle to process and digest that. So it is important to be aware of the spring tasks that you're doing, but ultimately spring is simply about fueling the growth in your colonies. Brood for a colony is growth of the population. Food is the fuel that allows them to build comb and make more brood. And so as long as your brood and your food are good and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, things are in good shape. One last thing that beekeepers do during the sort of cusp of the transition from spring into summer is a lot of beekeepers want to reverse the boxes in their overwintered colonies. So here we've got a 3-story colony, a 3-medium colony, where we can see that the bees have grown up during the winter into primarily occupying the blue and the yellow box on top. The pink box down below is basically emptied out and abandoned. Well, bees have an easier time growing upwards than they do growing downwards. And so beekeepers often find very good luck by taking a colony like this and swapping it around like you can see on the right. Take the empty box or boxes and put them above the brood area that the bees are currently using, and then they'll grow upwards into it, and they can store some of their newly incoming spring honey into that otherwise empty comb. So that's something that you should be thinking about doing. You may have already done, or you may want to do as we transition into summer beekeeping. So summer, I've had to sort of put in scare quotes here because summer means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In beekeeping, in our area of Greenwich, New York, we think that summer is basically early May until somewhere around mid-August. Now, if you don't live in Greenwich, those dates might not mean the same thing to you. And so the rule of thumb that I use is that when talking to beekeepers all over the world, the best strategy is to use plants that are found in the same locations, or rather found in all of those different locations. So dandelions are probably out in your yard, just like they're out in mine. And when your dandelions really reach the peak of their full spring bloom, that's when I would say that summer has begun. That's that first clear indication that we've transitioned from the end of winter starting to warm up stage into the bees are out there making honey and getting ready to start really booming stage. So these are the things we're going to talk about today, the essential tasks of summer beekeeping. We're going to talk about the need to inspect your colonies regularly, the need to give your bees more space when and if they need it, the way to manage your mite populations through the summer, the importance of monitoring your queen, and we'll talk a bit about the need to replace queens that have issues, and you may or you may not decide to harvest honey from your colonies in the summer, and that's really ultimately a choice that's up to you, but we'll talk about some pros and cons, and I'll give a few tips if you do just decide to make some summer honey. So we'll start at the beginning, which is inspecting our colonies. And I will use this opportunity and any opportunity presented to me to share this comb over comic. This is an in-house comic that we create here at Betterbee. If you want to see the new ones, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. But in this one, clearly we've got a beekeeper inspecting their hive, but we need to be careful because we might also be under some scrutiny while we're in there, right? The bees themselves are watching us as we do our inspections, so we better make sure we're careful and gentle as we do it. All right. So when we're inspecting our colonies, how often should we be doing it? How often should I be going into my hives? Well, the answer varies a lot. If you're a master beekeeper, like our head beekeeper, Anne Fry, then she can get away with inspecting our colonies every 3 weeks, maybe every 3.5, maybe every 4 weeks, right? If she goes into a colony on a month-to-month basis, she is often going to be able to understand and anticipate what the bees are going to do over the next few weeks, and she can then make plans or do management in order to anticipate their needs and make sure that they're fulfilled. Now, that doesn't mean she doesn't make mistakes. 3.5 weeks is plenty of time for bees to really go haywire. But Anne also trusts that she's a skilled enough beekeeper that if she does go back and do a reinspection and find that something's gone wrong, she has the ability and opportunity to correct it. So that's a strategy that works for her as she uses her great, vast expertise and experience to inspect hundreds and hundreds of colonies. For most people, though, that's not the best strategy. For most beekeepers, the general recommendation I give is that you should be inspecting your colonies about and at least every 2 weeks, maybe every 10 days to 2 weeks. It's going to give you an opportunity to go in, see what the colonies are up to, make any management steps that the colony requires from you, but you won't be bothering the bees all that much. But for a new beekeeper or a newer beekeeper, I recommend actually, if you can, inspecting your colonies weekly. Why? Well, you're going to disrupt the bees more. The bees are going to be bothered every time you go in and start monkeying around with them. But it's also going to give you a lot more opportunities to learn. The bees will tolerate it, and you are going to get a huge amount of beekeeping experience as you go into your colonies more often. If you inspect your colonies every week and I inspect mine every 2 weeks, at the end of one season of beekeeping, you've got twice as much beekeeping experience as me because you've been in your colonies twice as often. The other reason I recommend this is a newer beekeeper is often going to be more likely to miss some of the subtle cues that a colony might be advertising to them. If you aren't able to detect that earliest glimmer of the colony getting ready to swarm, if you come back a week later, you may still have an opportunity to intervene and to take some corrective action. But if you're going in every 2 weeks, then you might very well come back and find that the colony has already swarmed, and now you're playing catch up. You do, however, need to remember to inspect your apiary more often than you're inspecting your hives. What I mean by that is you don't need to get the smoker and the veil and go and open up every colony and look in every brood nest in order to do an inspection of your bees. You can just walk past or drive past the apiary and take a peek at it to make sure everything is okay. Because sometimes it isn't, right? Every once in a while, you might take a peek at your apiary and find that despite your lovely electric bear fence, somehow a bear has gotten into your colony, right? Come into the hive, knocked things over, pulled out some frames and eaten them and caused a real disruption. Maybe a bear or it may be wind, but you can have a colony suffer a really catastrophic event. And if you're not there to notice it and set the boxes back up and get them reestablished, it can be the difference between a colony that has been inconvenienced and a colony that has been killed after it was exposed to the elements. And this is obviously a pretty silly bear photo, but this one is a little less silly, at least to me. This is a photo I took this spring of one of my own colonies because I wasn't able to get my electric fence repaired and set up the way I wanted before the bears came out of hibernation. So this is one of my colonies, was knocked down. The bear ripped open the hive. On the left, we can see the big, fat tongue marks where the bear was licking honey out of this comb. And on the right, we can see those long claw marks as the bear was pawing and pulling at this frame. So this is the kind of thing we want to avoid. And if a bear does visit our hives, we want to be able to see that something's happened to the apiary and step in quickly to help. There's other work that happens in the apiary too. We can't schedule an hour a week to go do our hour-long, inspections of however many hives we've got, because sometimes you're going to have to do extra bee yard chores. And so this is bee yard work that doesn't require a hive tool. It requires a lawnmower or a weed whacker to go in and find colonies like this and make the colonies start looking like this instead. And the important thing that I want you to notice is that there was information that wasn't available to us in this photo that is available now. Look at the colony that's closest to us. There's a big beard on the entrance to that colony. The bees are telling us something about their temperature and their relative population to the amount of space that they've got. But we're not going to be able to see that if the colonies are all choked up with vegetation. So make sure you keep your apiaries tidy. Have you ever had that dream where you're walking around your house and then you turn and you see a door that you've never really opened before? So you open it up and you go in and you find a whole new room or a whole new wing to the house, a whole new level that you had completely forgotten existed. I have to imagine that's sort of how bees feel when we add a super to the colony, that suddenly everything that they thought they knew about their home is radically changed. But it is really, really important during the summer that you are giving your bees as much space as they need so that they're able to thrive. So a challenge a lot of beekeepers struggle with is, when should I put a new box onto my hive? And the answer is a little bit different depending upon what your bees are doing. So if your hives are building comb, if that's what you're having them do, building out new foundation on a box, comb on foundation in a box, the rule of thumb that we use is that you want to wait until 70 to 80% of the comb in that box has been drawn out and built before you put the next box on top. And the reason for that is you don't want the bees to go up and get distracted by the central combs in the new box and then neglect all of the outer combs on the box below. But you also don't want to wait until the bottom box is 100% done, because if you do, the bees are probably going to start feeling so cramped that they could get ready to swarm even if there were more boxes sitting in your shed waiting to go on top of them. The other really important thing to consider is that foundation isn't space from the perspective of a bee colony. When we talk about the bees needing extra space to raise brood or to store food, foundation doesn't really cut it. What we're talking about are cells of comb. And so when we put foundation onto a colony that's already feeling honey-bound, that's already feeling constricted by incoming nectar, yes, they will consume some of that nectar to make the comb, but there is still a risk that the bees are going to feel cramped and constricted, even though there's a whole new box of foundation that you've just put on above them. Now, if instead your colonies are on wax comb that's already been built out, when do you add a new box to them? Well, the same rule of thumb sort of applies. You wait for the box to be 70 to 80% full of brood or honey or whatever it is that the bees are putting in it, or you can wait for it to be about 70 to 80% covered in bees, really occupied by bees that are using that space. All of these rules of thumb, any of these rules of thumb, sort of essentially boil down to you're waiting for 70 to 80% of something to happen. So in a 10-frame box, you're waiting for about 8 of those frames to be occupied or filled up. One thing to notice is that as your bees are building, they build from the center outwards most of the time, which means that the outermost frames are the last ones to get built and sometimes the last ones to get filled, certainly with brood. So if you are trying to buy a little bit of time before you put the next box on your bees, one strategy is to take the outermost frames and to move them a few positions in the colony. That's going to cause them to suddenly recognize that those underbuilt frames need a little bit more attention, and they're going to go in and finish out that work. That's something you might do at the same time that you are putting that extra box on top. Or if you find that the bees need that new box, but you don't have it with you, you can do the frame swap first and then go and come back the next day or two with the boxes to install on top of the hives. Adding supers is a really important part of summer beekeeping, and it really starts in the spring. It begins whenever your honey flow starts, and for a lot of us, there's a robust spring honey flow before summer really starts to roll. So here again in Greenwich, our maple trees generally peak around the last week of April, all things considered, averaging together a bunch of years, and our dandelions generally come on about May 1st. With warmer weather coming, sometimes we see these days creeping a little bit earlier, but something in this neighborhood tells us when we need to get our supers on our colonies. We need to make sure that that maple nectar and that dandelion nectar is going somewhere, and we want it to go into our supers and not into our brood nest. When you're supering, something really important to consider is what you're supering with. So a lot of beekeepers will say, oh, I make a lot of honey and I use 9 frames in my 10-frame boxes. The bees go up there, they build the frames out nice and fat, and then it's really easy to uncap them, and I can run them through the extractor and get tons of honey out of them. That's all true. It's a perfectly valid practice. But newer beekeepers can sometimes get thrown off because they'll go up and they'll put 9 frames of foundation up in their supers and hope that the bees will go up and build them. That's a real mistake. By violating the bee space before the bees have built out the comb, they're going to be more likely to make burr comb or misshapen comb in between those frames. So what you want to do is, if you're supering with foundation, you want to put in 10 frames so that they're nice and tightly packed together. After the bees have built out the comb on each individual frame, yes, you can remove one, space them out evenly, and then get fatter frames full of honey. But don't fall into that trap of thinking 9 frames of foundation is going to cut it. The other thing to consider is that strong colonies may need to get 2 drawn supers at the same time. And sometimes that feels crazy to beekeepers. They think they've got to add boxes one at a time, but there's no law that says that you have to do that. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. If you know when your honey flows are coming, if you can anticipate that some big nectar flow is about to come in, understand that nectar is majority water, but honey is majority sugar. If you know that your bees on some upcoming nectar flow every single year are able to make 1 super full of honey based on that flow, how many supers do they need? More than 1. Because that nectar, as it comes in, is going to be maybe 60 to 80% water. And the rest of that sugar is going to need to be concentrated down as the bees evaporate a lot of that moisture out of the honey. What that means is that during the very limited number of days that those flowers are blooming, the bees are going to need to bring in a huge amount of nectar. Then they're going to need to condense it down to that 1 super filled with capped honey. So if you know your bees are going to make a super worth of honey, expect to give them more than a super worth of space in order to do that. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you've got a lot of small hive beetle pressure on your hives, there is a risk, there's a danger that by giving the bees too much comb, more than the colony is able to guard, they can get overwhelmed as the beetles start to get a foothold and reproduce. So remember that you need to be mindful of the bee to comb ratio whenever you're dealing with small hive beetles, but there are still plenty of circumstances where a really big upcoming nectar flow might necessitate multiple supers going on, the bees ripening all of that nectar into honey, and then as they start to clear out some of those frames, yes, you can pull the combs and the supers back off. The reason for all of this is that if you have extra room above your brood nest, it means the bees won't be tempted to pack that huge amount of incoming nectar into the brood nest itself. And that means the colony won't become honey-bound. So here are a couple of photos we've taken here at Betterbee of honey-bound colonies. Here we can see that we've got this nice stripe of capped brood, and then up to the left we've got some honey, we've got some pollen, honey up in the corner, that's all normal. But down here in the lower right of the photo, we also have nectar. We've got this incoming nectar and some capped brood interspersed amongst it, but the queen doesn't have anywhere to go in there and lay new eggs. So when you find that you've got your brood, your pollen, and your nectar all packed right up next to one another, there is a serious risk that the colony is going to start to feel cramped, and cramped colonies are colonies that get ready to swarm. What if you don't have enough supers? What if you simply don't have enough medium boxes full of drawn comb available to put up onto your colonies? Well, one strategy is to buy them and then hope that the bees can build out the comb quickly. But in the immortal words of Tim Gunn, you might just need to make it work. And in this case, we've made this work by supering these colonies up with deep boxes full of deep frames instead of medium boxes full of medium frames. Now, in the Bee Lab at Cornell, I spent years doing all of my research in an operation that exclusively used deep frames. All of our honey supers were deep boxes with deep frames. And I will tell you, it's not fun to lift 2 or 3 or 4 deep supers full of honey off of a colony just so that you can get into the brood nest to do some manipulation or collect some data. So as a beekeeper, I do not recommend deep supers to people as a matter of course. But if you find yourself in the circumstance where the flow is on and all you've got is deep combs, absolutely deep supers are a reasonable strategy. Just be aware that it'll be pretty heavy for you to manipulate, and you might even need to take the frames out one at a time and shake the bees off, put them into a nuke box, and then carry 3 or 4 of them instead of carrying all 10 of them at once. Now, there is a downside to all of this growth that our colonies go through, because in nature, our bees grow their population after winter. And in nature, bees are going to generally swarm, divide themselves reproductively in spring and summer so that they can make daughter colonies. It's the way that one bee colony becomes 2 or 3 or 4. And so that's a behavior that is very, very intimately conserved in our bees. They want to make sure they have that chance to reproduce. And the problem that we struggle with is that our bees don't know that they don't live in nature anymore. They live in our hives, and we really don't want them to swarm, but we don't have any clear way of telling them that. So we have to manage our bees, and the best way to do that is to understand why swarming happens, to see if we can intervene before they get triggered to start it. So the triggers of swarming are varied, and they all add and feed into one another. But a colony that has come through a previous winter and is now in the midst of that growth stage, that's a colony that's more likely to swarm. A queen that has gotten through at least one winter is more likely to have her bees swarm with her. If the colony has no room to put nectar, they're more likely to swarm. If the colony has no room for the queen to continue to lay eggs and grow the brood nest, they are more likely to swarm. Those are related but not identical things. So depending upon the circumstances in the colony, the honey flows, how much brood comb you've given them, the bees can either become honey bound, they can run out of nectar storage room, or the queen can just run out of space. And in both cases, that can be a trigger for swarming. The observation hive behind me here, as you can see, is just a 2-frame hive. This is the observation hive that I use in my office every fall and winter and into the spring. But come mid to late spring, maybe early summer, I've got to get these bees into a regular hive. Because even though there's only 2 frames of bees in there, they will quickly outgrow that space. The queen will run out of room, and they will begin preparations to send out a teeny tiny little swarm. And so any colony can swarm regardless of how big they are, as long as they're feeling these swarm triggers. And one really important and potent swarm trigger is that there isn't enough queen pheromone circulating inside of the hive. High levels of queen pheromone stop queen rearing. Low levels of queen pheromone allow bees to build queen cups, and then those queen cups, when eggs are laid in them, are drawn out into queen cells, and the swarming process has begun. Those preparations have begun. Older queens produce less pheromone, and the more bees there are in a colony, the less queen there is to go around. And so really big colonies have lower levels of queen pheromone. Older queens, like ones that have lived through one winter already, have lower levels of the pheromone, and both of those can contribute to swarming. So how do we fight this behavior? Well, we don't want to let the colony become crowded or full of nectar. We need to expand the brood nest whenever the bees need more brood rearing space, and we need to super the colonies whenever they tell us that they've got their honey storage filled up and they need more space to do more honey production. You might also consider splitting the colony, which is essentially giving in to the swarming instinct, but trying to get ahead of it, saying, all right, fine, if you want to turn into 2 different colonies, fine by me, but we're going to do it on my terms instead of on your terms. One thing you don't want to do is simply panic and cut out all of the queen cells, because on more than one occasion, I did that as a newer beekeeper. I'd cut out the queen cells. I'd say, "Whew, now I've prevented this colony from swarming." And I'd sit back and I'd look up into the tree, and there was the swarm that had left 2 hours before I even got to the apiary. Well, now what have I done? I can't catch that swarm. I can't cram them back into the box, and I've now cut out all of the replacement queens that that colony was raising. So I've gotten this colony into much deeper trouble by ripping out those queen cells. The other reason you might not want to do that is if you decide that as a colony is getting ready to swarm, the queen's still there, but you've got these queen cells. If you decide that you want to make a split, those queen cells can be a really valuable resource to you as you're figuring out how you want to split your colonies. Now, splitting a colony in two can range from a very easy process to substantially less easy processes. The easiest is the walk-away split, where you take a colony that's in more than one box, you split the boxes apart and set one up as a new hive, and then you walk away. One side has the queen, one side doesn't. They're going to have to make an emergency replacement queen. Hopefully that process will go well, and then you can just manage these colonies, and at some point you'll open them up and say, oh, I guess you had the original queen, and I guess you were the one that didn't get her. Much more efficient, much faster is to use a queen cell, like from a colony that was just getting ready to swarm, and to pop that into the queenless side of your walk-away split. So you make your split, you put the queen cell into the queenless side of it, and now you've gotten a major jump start into the colony's ability to make that new queen. If you do a walk-away split, the production of an emergency queen, her ability to reach sexual maturity after she hatches, then to go off and mate, then to come back, then to start laying eggs, means that you might have up to 30 days from when you do that split to when you've actually got a really robust laying queen back inside of that colony again. And that's only if everything goes right. And so 30 days of a queen not laying eggs, if we figure the average queen lays at least 1,000 eggs a day during the summer, means that you've got 30,000 bees that don't get produced. And 30,000 bees, that's a whole colony of bees. So you really don't want to impose that major efficiency hit to a colony without understanding what you're doing by doing those walk-away splits. So a queen cell split gives you a head start. An even faster head start is making a split with a purchased queen, just buying a queen from a queen breeder and then installing her into the queenless side of your split. She's going to be out of that cage, hopefully in a matter of days, and will be very quickly laying eggs and regrowing that colony. And so that's another strategy that you can use. The most complicated way to do it, of course, is to split with your own queens. Set up some of your own hives, set up starter finishers, do some grafting, make a bunch of queen cells, and then take those queen cells and pop them either into mating nukes or into the splits that you're making. It's a really efficient way to make a whole lot of queens if you like your queen genetics, you really like your queen breeding, and you also probably, have a couple hundred hives that you need to requeen or that you need to split. They can become very cost-effective at that point to learn how to do that queen breeding. Most folks, though, are not going to be doing that. You'll be using one of the first three strategies. Before you split your colony, though, there's a really important question that I always ask beekeepers, and sometimes if we don't think this through, we can wind up with disappointing results. So let's imagine we've got one really big booming colony over here on the left, and we've decided that we want to split them so that they don't swarm. Well, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to divide this colony? Are you going to take about half of their resources and split them between two different boxes? That can absolutely work, and what you wind up with is now two medium-sized colonies. And if you put a queen or a queen cell into the one that doesn't get the original queen, you can wind up pretty quickly getting them both back into growth and productivity mode. Or instead, are you trying to pull a nuke out of a colony? Are we going to split this colony on the left by simply taking 5 frames, 10 frames, something in that neighborhood, but leaving the majority of the bees and resources back behind in the original colony? One really clever strategy here is to take the original queen out with that nuke so that now she's got a tiny little colony, a tiny little number of bees. Clearly, she's going to look around and say, we've got to grow into this space before I swarm. Meanwhile, the colony left behind, as soon as they're requeened, is going to have lots of bees, lots of resources, lots of space, and they can be a very productive colony that year. And you can do what we do here at Betterbee, which is you can make many nukes out of a single colony. So in this case, this is something that we do every summer in some of our yards. We will get these great big, gigantic, 4-story tall colonies, and then we'll go in and we will break them down to basically nothing or to very low colonies by taking all of their extra brood and resources and packing them off into these tiny little nukes that we're going to grow up and overwinter so that we can sell them to beekeepers the following spring. And so this nuke production strategy is going to let you produce a whole bunch of bees, but you're probably not going to make much honey from the colony that they all came from. So you need to define that goal clearly. Am I making 2 medium-sized colonies where I might be able to get honey from them? Am I making 1 big colony and 1 teeny little nuke so that that big production colony can almost certainly make me a good honey crop this year? Or am I splitting a colony down into as many nukes as I can make, and then surely I'm not going to expect to harvest much honey from them? So if you can answer this question, am I pulling a nuke out of this colony or am I dividing this colony? It's much easier to then make your plan for how to set up your splits. Any split that you make, regardless of size, is going to need the same things. It needs bees, it needs carbohydrates in the form of either honey or sugar syrup that you give as a supplement. It's going to need protein, either in the form of stored pollen and bee bread, or a pollen patty that you give the bees as a supplement. And it's going to need brood. Depending upon the splitting strategy you're using, you might want to give your split, one side of the split, all of the capped brood so that all of the sealed up Varroa mites are inside, and then you can treat the other side of the split with something that doesn't penetrate the brood caps. Or you can take all of the open brood to one side and then leave the other behind. So you might just want to split your open and capped brood so that both colonies are growing evenly. Different strategies for different goals, but understand the consequences of the different brood that you move from one hive to another. Now, let's say we fail in our swarm our swarm prevention. Now we've got to talk about swarm collection. Swarms can be really nice if, instead of having to collect your own swarms from your own trees, you're able to collect somebody else's swarms that they weren't able to suppress, and then increase the number of hives in your apiary. So this is a really nice swarm collection. Obviously, the landowner has let our beekeeper Anne come in and trim these branches, and she's going to have a very easy time getting this nice low swarm shaken down into a box. It's not always that easy. So how do you collect swarms in the summer? Well, one strategy is to be prepared. Watch out for swarms wherever you go. Don't pop your earbuds into your ears before you walk up to the apiary for a day of inspections. Make sure that you're walking around, listening, looking, keeping your head on a swivel, and trying specifically to find any of your own bees that might be up in the trees as you walk up. Also, just keep an eye out for swarms all over the place because they can happen from any colony at any time. If you think you want to catch swarms, it's a really good idea to have a nuke box handy. Betterbee just had a customer contact us and say, hey, I ordered a whole bunch of hive equipment, but I want to cancel the order because the swarm flew away before you were able to ship it to me. And as fast as we try to be, I promise you we're not going to be able to get you a whole hive equipment to catch a swarm before that swarm gets a better offer from a hollow tree or a hole in your neighbor's wall and then flies off to live there. So you want to be prepared in advance to catch those swarms. I have a nuke box in my truck, just a plastic Pro Nuke box in my truck at all times with a bunch of frames in it. Yes, sometimes the wax melts off of the foundation and it's not the best frames in the world, but it's plenty of space for me to go find a swarm, catch them, shake them, coax them down into that box, seal them up, bring them home, and then give them some better equipment to go live on. So I strongly recommend that if you're interested in catching swarms, that you be prepared to catch them at any time. If you want to catch swarms, but you don't want to go to all of that trouble, you can also put out bait hives. So we know what swarms are looking for in a new home, and if you are able to give them something comparable to that, then you are potentially going to be able to passively catch swarms from the environment just by making them a good offer of somewhere to live. And if you're able to, get on a swarm catchers list. So if your local fire department or police department maintains a swarm catchers list, you can sign up for that. If your local bee association has a swarm list, see if you can get on that list. Betterbee actually has a national swarm catchers list that we maintain. And so anyone who wants to be on that, just send an email to support@betterbee.com and say, hey, I want to catch swarms, or I'm able to do cutouts. Here's my contact info. This is the region that I'm willing to do it in. And we'll throw that up on our website. We're always very happy to help support beekeepers in that way. So the next thing to talk about is the management of Varroa mites, something near and dear to my heart. The reason I want to emphasize this is because the consistent predicting factor for whether or not a beekeeper's colonies are going to do well and live through the winter or do poorly and die during or before the winter is whether they are staying on top of Varroa mite management. And you need to manage your mites year round, including during the summer. So these devastating parasites are horrible. They crawl around on our bees. They suck the lifeblood out of them. But they also, very importantly, transmit and amplify honeybee viruses inside of the hive. So over here on the left, we've got a whole bunch of bee viruses. Deformed wing virus and its variant, Varroa destructor virus 1, sac brood virus, chronic bee paralysis virus. I don't need to impress you that I know what all of those initials stand for. The point is that many of these viruses are transmitted by mites, and many of them are also amplified. The presence of the mites transmitting these from old bees to young bees to old bees to young bees to old bees to young bees increases the concentration, the quantity of this virus inside of the hive. And that can be really devastating, lead to things like the wing deformities that we can see on the right here in this photo. The bee population grows predictably year to year. So I really like this graph. I use it in a lot of my talks because in yellow and sort of labeled over here on the left is the bee population over the course of a single year. Starting in January, it's very low. It climbs up in the spring. It reaches a peak in the summer. It starts to taper down as the bees get into fall and winter mode. And then it's pretty low in the winter before it regrows in the spring. Straightforward. Well, the red line shows us the mite population. It starts low. Hopefully, we've got our mites under control, at least at the start of the project. But then the mite population grows exponentially. Whenever those bees are in that colony reproducing and raising brood, the mites have a chance to reproduce as well. And so these mites are building and building and building and building. They reach their own peak. They taper off as the bee population starts to decline. But the mite population can grow catastrophically. So we know that we need to treat our mites to get our bees safely mite-free or as close to mite-free as possible in the winter. But that's not the biggest concern for Varroa and bee health. So if you remember your high school calculus, you know that the area underneath a line can also have its own meanings. And in this case, I think the area underneath that red line is really important. The area under that line we can look at as kind of an indication of the aggregate amount of Varroa mite feeding activity that has taken place inside of the hive. We know every time that line increases, the mite population goes up, it's because the mites are reproducing. And every time the mites reproduce, they've got to feed on a bee to get energy and nutrition. And they also transmit and amplify viruses. And so that means that we can use the area under that curve as at least a proxy, an indicator for the mite levels or the virus levels inside of this hive over the course of the active season. That means that as this mite population grows and grows and grows, the virus population is also growing to dangerous levels. It also means that if I come in and I treat my Varroa and I kill all of the mites, I have some miracle cure, I'm going to kill every single mite in, let's say, mid-September, that's all well and good, but that virus damage has already been done. Those viruses don't go away when the mites are killed. And so it means that your colony can actually die, succumb, collapse because of high levels of virus, even though the mites that originally transmitted it have already been killed. The point of this is to say that our goal as beekeepers is not just to get our mite levels low once a year, it's to keep them low continuously. Varroa have two different behavioral modes. In those modes, in the reproductive mode, they're going into cells, they're feeding on the hemolymph of the bees, they're laying eggs, and they are having their offspring incestuously mate with one another so that when the bee crawls out, the males die down in the cells, but the female mites come out pregnant and basically ready to reproduce as soon as they've built up their strength. They do that by going through the other life phase that we call either the phoretic stage or the dispersal stage. So the phoretic or dispersal stage is essentially the riding around on the adult bees stage for a Varroa mite, and they're going to feed on those bees directly. They suck nutrition right out of the fat body organs of those bees. So as they're draining those fat bodies, they're transmitting viruses, but they're also weakening our bees. These two different stages are also different opportunities for us to potentially kill Varroa mites in the hive. So, as I said, any opportunity to show you one of these comics, because they make me laugh every time I look at them. Here we've got a bee going to therapy, and she's really struggling with clinginess because she is in a really unhealthily dependent relationship with a Varroa mite that's clasped onto her. This is the situation a lot of bees have. They're sitting here with these mites clinging to their bodies, and it gives us an opportunity to go in and actually evaluate the mite population to figure out what treatment our colony might need from us. So you can sample for Varroa mites a lot of different ways, but the method that I typically recommend to most people, because it is frankly the most foolproof method, is to take a frame of bees out of the brood nest, make sure the queen isn't on it, shake those bees into a plastic tub like you can see here, knock the bees down into the corner and take a half cup measuring cup, scoop out a half cup of bees, because we know that a half cup of bees equals about 300 workers. Dump those bees into a mite sampling jar of some kind or a bottle of some kind, and then kill them with rubbing alcohol or an alcohol-based solvent. Kill the bees, swirl them around, slosh all of the mites off of them. You remove the bees by using a sieve or a colander. You can toss the bees off into the grass, and then you can count how many mites were left behind. So here we can see a large number of mites floating in that container. Your job as a beekeeper, I believe, during the summer, is to try to monitor your mite population monthly in your hives. Some people think that's crazy. They say, I would never do monthly mite monitoring. Well, fine. Then I beg you to try to do it twice a month. They say, I don't want to do that. All right, fine. Every 3 months, do something. Get as much data as you can about your mite population. But I promise you, you are going to have the best results and the most understanding of what's going on in your hives if you aim to do this monthly mite monitoring. Write down how many mites you've seen for each hive, and it lets you go back and start to chart a little bit of a graph of how many mites you had in that colony at different time points. You know whether the treatments that you used worked. You know whether you need to put a new treatment in. It's going to give you really good information about whether your mites are under control or not. You can monitor mites using a screened bottom board with a sticky board underneath it. It's a little harder to interpret those results, but you can figure out how many mites are falling down per day, and it'll at least give you some information. You can do the sugar shake method that involves using powdered sugar to dislodge a sample of mites from the bees. Research has shown us that those bees generally don't fare too well after they've gone through the trauma of being shaken around with a bunch of sugar on their bodies. So it is in some ways probably the kindest and most straightforward to simply kill your bees with the alcohol wash. I know that it is hard to kill 300 bees. I don't like to do it. But one thing to remember about bee colonies is bees, by their very nature, right, understanding the way that their sting works, are willing to give their lives in the interest of saving and protecting their family. Bees will sting you and die because they think that you're a threat to them. If you could explain to bees that 300 of them need to jump into this rubbing alcohol so that you can figure out whether or not their whole family needs to be treated or not, I guarantee you would have a line of bees much longer than 300 willing to volunteer for the job. And so the alcohol wash is the most straightforward method and the most reliable one. There are a lot of ways that you can do it. I really, really like this product, which is a Varroa mite test bottle. And it's just, there are a bunch of parts of the design I really like. It comes with a half cup measuring cup, that little plastic cup that I really like. The way that the colander and the sieve is designed, it hangs to drain bees really well. It's all really good. But my favorite part is that there is a gasket in between the lid and the bottom of that jar. And it means that when you're filling up your jar and you're sitting there swirling and swirling and swishing it around trying to knock the mites free, alcohol isn't leaking out and splashing and dripping all over you and your gloves, which I find very annoying. So this is by far my favorite and our bee team's favorite sampling product. If you don't monitor your mites, if you refuse to listen to anything that I just said, fine, they're your bees, that's your problem. But you may succeed if you treat your colonies every July 4th or thereabouts, and every Labor Day or thereabouts. It is the laziest, sloppiest way that you can manage your mites, but if you do those two interventions, you are reasonably likely to have a lot of your colonies get their mites more or less under control. It is not what I recommend by any means, but if you are going to ignore all the sampling, at the very least understand that summer is going to require multiple mite interventions, and that you need to understand when and why and if they're needed to make sure that you're doing the right ones at the right times. With that rule of thumb, 4th of July and Labor Day put in front of you, I will tell you that we sample our mites here at Betterbee, and we regularly find colonies that are on the verge of a mite crisis in June. Colonies that need us to intervene in June before things get really bad by July 4th. And so there's no guarantees that any of these dates or numbers are going to mean anything significant for you and your bees if you're not doing any of the work to figure out how many mites you've got. Now, how do we monitor, or rather, how do we manage these mites once we've got a monitoring scheme in place? Well, there's a lot of different products that are available, but the three groups of products that I am most likely to recommend are the ones that are based on organic acid molecules. So one of them is based on formic acid, naturally found in bee venom, among other things. So it's a molecule that's supposed to be in the hive, and that is available in the product Formic Pro. It penetrates the brood caps, which is it's the only miticide that does that. So it kills the mites in the brood and the mites on the bees, but it is temperature dependent. And for the summer, the thing that we need to be paying attention to is you can't use Formic Pro if your outside ambient high temperatures are above 85 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple days in a row during that treatment, especially the first few days of the treatment. It's very important to be below that threshold. So for some of us, it may simply be too hot for many months of the summer for us to do that treatment. The other organic acid that works well is oxalic acid, also naturally found in colonies because it's naturally found in the nectars of some plants that bees collect and make honey out of. This can be applied a couple of different ways, and I'll talk about each of them, but the vaporization method or dribble methods are both really valuable. And these are really, really good at killing mites if you've got little to no brood present. Let's say you did a split and now you've got a broodless colony or a colony with no capped brood. Magnificent mite kill. If you've got brood, you can do repeated treatments to try to catch the mites that had been under the caps during the previous treatment, but it's still not going to be super duper effective. You're going to have a moderate success, but you're not going to, knock your mite level down to zero with one or even multiple treatments. And then the other thing that has worked well for a number of beekeepers are Varroxan strips. These are an extended release oxalic acid product, and those also work well. A lot of folks are really excited about a new product called Varroa, and I'll talk a bit about that. I can't unreservedly recommend that to you for summer mite management because, frankly, I haven't used it myself yet, and I don't want to make that recommendation until I have. It's just been released in the U.S. A lot of beekeepers are going to be using it this summer, and I think we're going to learn a lot about where it works and where it doesn't work and where it sort of works and what strategies were most or least effective when beekeepers tried to use it. So maybe next year I'll have different things to say about it for summer management. For now, it's a question mark for me. And then there are other products based on thymol, the essential oil of the herb thyme, or apivar, which is based on amitraz, the synthetic pesticide. You can't use any of those products if you've got supers on the hive because they're going to contaminate your honey. However, there are circumstances during the summer where you may have a colony that isn't making any honey for you. Maybe it's a queen bank or a breeder colony. Maybe you've got a new swarm or a split that needs to be treated, but that isn't going to have any honey supers on them for a long period of time. For those, you may reach for some of these other products, but I want to emphasize the organic acid products that are generally going to be useful for most colonies in most of the summer. So this is Formic Pro, and it is a straightforward product. It is applied wearing gloves and the appropriate safety gear by taking these two strips and unwrapping them, putting them in between the brood boxes of your colony, and then it creates a formic acid vapor that penetrates the caps, circulates in the colony, and kills Varroa mites. Again, the key here is the temperature range, 50 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit as your daytime highs that you need to be watching out for. Oxalic acid vaporization is very popular. There's a few different ways that you can do it. You can use apibioxyl oxalic acid powder, or you can use Easyox oxalic acid powder. And the difference between them is essentially just the brand name. Two different companies making basically the same oxalic acid powder. The way that this is used in a vaporizer is that you use electricity, either a battery or something hooked up to an outlet, to heat up a heating element that's going to cause those oxalic acid crystals to vaporize, to sublimate, and to create this fume inside of the hive. And then they'll immediately recrystallize on everything inside and distribute those teeny tiny little microcrystals on everything, on the mites, on the bees, on the comb, and the mites that are exposed to it are killed. This is safe to use with supers in place, and beekeepers find that they can get okay mite control during the summer if they're repeatedly applying this stuff. However, you'll see here in this photo, Anne is wearing her required safety gear, that full face respirator mask that you want to wear so that you don't get this oxalic acid vapor or these fumes getting up into your eyes and your lungs, in your nose and your mouth, where they can cause really severe and pretty nasty damage to you. I don't like wearing that mask in the winter when I do an OA vaporization. I certainly don't like wearing it when it's 95 degrees Fahrenheit out in the middle of the summer. So I am really excited by this new product. This is a new product called Apibioxyl RTU. RTU stands for ready to use. And it's a ready-to-use dribble product that you can put right on top of your hives. No mixing, no calculations, just putting it right onto the bees. It's oxalic acid and non-sugar ingredients. So the other OA dribble that you might have heard of involves sugar syrup being sort of the carrier for the oxalic acid. But then the bees are tempted to eat their medicine. Bees don't want to eat this. There's a higher concentration of oxalic acid relative to the homemade sugar dribble, and there isn't a maximum dose per hive. It's simply 5 milliliters per seam of bees in the brood nest. So if it's a nuke, if it's an 8-frame box, if it's a 10-frame box, if it's 2 stories or 3 stories, however big your brood nest is, you just dribble 5 milliliters in between every occupied frame space that has bees in it. And explicitly on the label, it says that you can apply these treatments weekly up to 4 times in a treatment course when the colony has got brood, and that allows you to go in and reduce your mite infestation, and it can reduce the brood infestation of those mites. And I can say that with confidence because this past summer, Betterbee's bee team worked in collaboration with the University of Florida, Cameron Jack's lab down there in Gainesville, and we both tested Apibioxyl RTU against other oxalic acid treatments and other miticides. And we were very pleased with the way that the RTU performed in those experiments. So there's some really cool work that is in the process of getting submitted for publication. Hopefully that scientific paper will come out at some point relatively soon. But in the meantime, I can tell you that it's a really good product. It performed really well when we tested it and when they tested it in Florida. Also safe to use with your supers in place, and applying it is pretty straightforward because all you're going to do is put it into a syringe or one of these little dosing bottles that you can get, and then you can squeeze up, let's say 50 milliliters for the 10 bee spaces that you intend to treat, and then you just trickle it right out of the nozzle on the end of this device. So trickle it down in between on those bees. The oxalic acid has a longer residual time in the hive than when you vaporize, and it seems to be a really effective way to knock your mite levels down and to keep them down. The other OA product I want to talk about is Varroxan. These are these extended release strips, which are a mixture of oxalic acid and glycerin that has been soaked into some kind of a cardboard or a fiber board strip. So this is a product that you hang in between the frames of your brood nest, and it is consistent research has shown with this product, with similar products, with homemade formulations, that these extended release oxalic acid products are good at slowing down or maybe even stopping the rate of mite population growth. If your mites are under control, they can help to keep them under control. They are not the best product to reach for if you have really catastrophically high mite levels and you need to knock them down quickly. So it's a keep down treatment, not a knockdown treatment, and that is something that you would use in conjunction with other interventions. But it can be a really powerful tool in that arsenal when you're fighting against Varroa. The other product I mentioned, Varroa, has an active ingredient called Vadiscana. And it is an RNAi-based miticide. So RNAi is a genetic technology. It stands for RNA interference. And the technology has a bunch of different applications all over biology. But geneticists and biologists have basically figured out this way that you can create a double-stranded RNA molecule. This is what's illustrated over on the right. You can put that molecule into a creature, and then the creature's own proteins are going to go in and start manipulating and interacting with that molecule. As they do that, if you've created the molecule in just the right way, it can essentially hijack some of that machinery inside the in this case, Varroa mite's body, and then it goes around looking for other RNA molecules, other genetic molecules, whose job is to, let's say, go over to a different part of the cell and cause it to create a new protein that the animal needs to live. Well, in this case, it's going to go in, it's going to find this messenger molecule that is really important to making eggshell proteins for Varroa mites, and it's going to chop it up. And so now the message doesn't get through. It's basically sitting there chopping up all of the letters that the DNA is trying to send off to the protein manufacturing parts of the cell. And so the mite is now unable to produce those eggshell proteins. It doesn't kill Varroa, but it's been described by the folks selling it as birth control for Varroa mites. It interferes with their ability to reproduce. So this, as I said, is a brand new product on the market. It's got really interesting technology behind it. How exactly it's going to work and when it's going to work and when it won't work, these are still things that need to be ironed out. But I'm really excited to monitor it. And if you're trying it out, then please let me know how it performs for you this season. Overall, though, the take-home message for Varroa management is that your job is not just to get the Varroa mites low before you go into winter. It's to keep your Varroa mites low throughout the year so that you don't have this dangerous accumulation of dangerous viruses inside of the colony. All right, that's enough doom and gloom about those. Another thing that you're going to do during your summer is you're going to be monitoring for queen issues. And so there's a number of reasons that you might find a problem with your queen during an inspection. You might find a poor brood pattern that indicates that the queen is either unhealthy or maybe is declining in some way. You might find a queen who's only laying drone eggs. That means she's run out of stored sperm. You might find a queen who's simply missing. You don't find her at all because she's gone. And you might find that your queen is being superseded, replaced by the bees. They've judged her inadequate in some way. What do you do in all of these cases? Well, you need to replace that queen. You can't get sentimental about your queen because you need to make sure that the colony as a whole is able to grow and thrive. And the queen is foundational to that. So one thing that beekeepers do as they go through their hives is they evaluate the brood pattern. So this is a frame that has some capped brood on it. It's also got some empty cells. And we as beekeepers need to be able to look at this and say, is this a great brood pattern, a good brood pattern, a bad brood pattern? And that's a little bit subjective, but there are some strategies you can use to try to evaluate whether or not your queen is doing a good job of essentially doing what you want her to do, going to cell after cell after cell after cell, laying egg after egg after egg after egg, and having every egg hatch, every larva be healthy, every larva be taken care of, and grow up into a nice, healthy worker bee. So we can look at a frame like this and say, yeah, that looks like it's a pretty darn good brood pattern. I see a couple of gaps here and there, but we can't fault the queen for that. In general, this is an entire frame of capped brood, and it looks pretty good to me. You can get yourself in trouble trying to judge brood patterns if you aren't clear about what you're looking at, though. So this is a frame taken from the brood nest of a colony, and if this was right smack in the middle of the colony, I might not be worried so much about the brood pattern, but the overall amount of brood. If I took this from the very outermost edge of that brood nest, I'm not worried at all because I assume I've got more frames of capped brood going towards the middle of the box. If this was in frame position 1 or frame position 2, I don't think that colony's in trouble. I think that colony's at risk of swarming because they're growing so well. So you've got to be able to understand and evaluate how to judge the brood pattern, especially at different times of year. In spring, colonies can sort of grow by fits and starts, and so there might be some apparent issues in the brood pattern that over the course of the summer will either continue to manifest or will sort themselves out. You do have to have a discerning eye when you're looking at the brood as well. So is this a good brood pattern? Well, no, it's very widely scattered. And as I'm looking at the domed caps on these cells, I'm also getting worried that I might have a lot of drones developing where they shouldn't be. All right, this is another frame where we've got a whole bunch of capped drone brood in a colony where I was not expecting to find it. Why is this happening? Well, it can happen for a couple of reasons, but the most critical of them, the most problematic of them, is that you may have laying workers. When the queen in a colony dies, the bees will use eggs and young larvae to raise an emergency replacement. When the emergency replacement queen, for whatever reason, also dies, maybe she gets eaten by a bird or lost on her way home from mating, now the colony is in a hopelessly queenless state. And those hopelessly queenless colonies have no way to get their genes out into the next generation except to allow some of the sister workers to develop their ovaries and start laying eggs. And so they will lay these unfertilized eggs that grow up into sort of mediocre drones that the colony will take care of until the last worker dies, and then that'll be the end of them. The problem is that beekeepers will sometimes panic that they've got laying workers when in fact something very different is going on. So in the photo on the right, we have eggs that were laid by laying workers. Lots and lots and lots of eggs all over the cell, particularly on the walls of the cells. Over here on the left, we've got, again, multiple eggs in the cell, and they're not always laid right down at the back of the cell. They're not laid in that sort of optimal location. That's not a laying worker colony. That's a colony with a brand new mated queen who is now marching around trying to figure out all of her plumbing works, how all of her plumbing works, and how she's supposed to lay one egg in each and every cell. So, if the colony has no brood, maybe because they swarmed and they've been making a replacement queen for a while, and then you start to see multiple eggs per cell, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's laying workers. It could be a new queen getting her sea legs under her. One really good way to judge this is queens have long, long abdomens. They have them so that they can stretch their butts all the way down to the back of the cells that they're laying in. Laying workers don't, and that's why they've got to lay their eggs on the side walls of the cell. They just can't get their butt all the way down to the back of the cell without messing up their wings. And so if you're finding multiple eggs per cell, but they're way down at the back of the cells, the bottoms of the cells, that's more an indication that you've got a queen figuring things out than it is that you've got laying workers. If you do have laying workers, though, it becomes a lot more obvious when the brood starts to get capped. And you can see that we've got nothing here but capped drone brood that were originally laid in worker-sized cells. And this is a real mess. Unfortunately, there's not anything that I can give you that will guarantee that you'll be able to turn a laying worker colony back into a queen right colony. There are a lot of tips and tricks and strategies and things that have worked for me, but they have also failed for me some of the times I've tried them. So there are no guarantees with laying workers. Ideally, it's something you'll avoid. The other thing to consider is that your colony may start making a new queen. Now, we've already talked about swarming and swarm cells. That's a different issue. But if you find that your colony is making cells that look like this, you may have different things you need to do depending upon the purpose of the cells. The cells over here on the left, those are emergency replacement cells. This is a colony whose queen has suddenly died, maybe been crushed by a clumsy beekeeper during their last inspection. And when we go in and find cells like this, it is essentially the colony screaming, this is our last possible chance. If we don't raise these queen cells into a mated queen, we're going to become hopelessly queenless and we're going to turn into laying workers. So when you see this, many cells from normal worker eggs that have had the wax modified and remodeled around them to create that space for the queen to grow up, that indicates that you've got an emergency situation. Over here on the right, though, that's not an emergency cell, even though it's coming right out of the comb, even though it was made from a modified worker egg that the bees decided to turn into a queen instead. That's a supersedure cell. One way you can tell that you've got a supersedure going on is that you've got the maybe just one or two of these cells in the entire hive instead of a frame that's got 10 of them all at once. Another good way to tell you have a supersedure cell is that your colony still has their queen. You can find that queen marching around. But the bees, for whatever reason, have decided that she needs to be replaced. They can't trust her to even take a swarm away. They're just going to replace her with this new queen. After the supersedure queen emerges, after she flies off, after she mates, after she comes home, after she starts laying eggs, the bees will turn on their mom, the original queen, and they will basically heat hug her to death so that she is eliminated and the colony now has this one new replacement to take over. When I find that my bees are superseding their queen, my action is to do nothing. Because in my professional opinion, as someone with a PhD in honeybee behavior, I guarantee that no human is as good at judging the quality of a queen as the bees that live with her are. If my bees tell me this is a bad queen or a queen that is sick or a queen that is in trouble and a queen that must be replaced, who am I to challenge them on that? So I will normally allow supersedure to take place, and I'll simply monitor the colony to make sure that everything's going smoothly. The reason that I'm emphasizing all of this stuff about queen quality is that you really need to think about the seasons of beekeeping in which you are able to requeen your bees. So you can't requeen your bees in winter, right? Understandable. I can't sell you a queen. I can't ship her to you. I'm not breeding queens. And so how could I get a new queen to your colony in the middle of winter? You also can't get a new queen in spring unless you've pre-ordered her, you've gotten her in advance, because generally folks are really eagerly snapping up any of the first queens that are produced in the US. They're going into packages, they're being used to make splits by beekeepers who've got a whole bunch of bees. So it can be very difficult to get your hands on a queen in the spring. And you also can't generally get a queen in the fall. Most queen breeders stop as the summer wears on. And if you requeen your colony in the middle of the fall, when they're supposed to be laying all of the winter bees that are going to grow up and take care of that colony until the following spring, you can really catastrophically interrupt that colony's progress. So what that means is that of the 4 seasons of the year, there's really only one in which we can responsibly and successfully and easily requeen our colonies, either by having them raise their own queen or by buying a queen from a queen breeder or a bee supplier like Betterbee. So that's why your last chance to requeen your queen, requeen a colony that has a possibly problem queen, is really the end of the summer, before you have to then get all the way through to the beginning of the following summer, or maybe the middle to end of the next spring, before you have another opportunity for intervention. A queen that is looking marginal to you in July or August, I strongly recommend you replace as soon as you can so that you can get that colony reestablished, because the last thing you want is a perfectly healthy colony to get 3/4 of the way through winter and have their queen keel over and suddenly find themselves in a hopeless situation. This is why beekeepers will often habitually requeen their colonies. They will requeen every colony every single year, or they will requeen the colonies at least every 2 years. Don't let your queens last more than 2 years. If you're doing a good job of suppressing swarming and the colonies aren't making a new queen every year after a swarm, generally you are going to find yourself running into problems with queens that get older and older and older. So it is difficult emotionally and financially to pinch all of your queens and then get new queens to replace them. But beekeepers do find that they have the most productive, honey yields. They have the least swarms when they're getting brand new queens and putting them into these colonies every year. The last thing I want to say is offer a warning about judging your brood patterns. So this is a brood pattern in a colony that I think most beekeepers would look at and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. Not perfect. There's some gaps. There's some holes. I'm not loving quite as many of those empty cells as I can see, but it's probably all right, right? But there's a really, really big problem with looking at a photo of this frame, not knowing anything else about this colony, and trying to decide whether or not this is a good brood pattern. And that's this. When you buy a queen from somebody, more often than not, they are going to try to sell you on the good features of that queen. And the thing that they are most likely to talk about, they'll say, yeah, they make honey. Sure, they've got a nice disposition. They're not very aggressive. But the thing that this beekeeper is going to try to emphasize to you, and the thing that you're going to pay the most for when you're buying that queen, is the suggestion that those bees are resistant to Varroa mites. What are we breeding our bees to do when we're trying to increase Varroa resistance? Why did I go into this colony, take out a brood frame, set it down over here on the right with a big piece of PVC crushed down into the brood, take my thermos full of liquid nitrogen that I maybe stole from the Cornell University chemistry department on a Saturday when no one was guarding it, but we don't need to get into that. And why did I pour that liquid nitrogen into that frame of brood? Well, it was because I was trying to freeze a circle of brood that I could put back into the colony and then come back the next day and see how successfully those bees had removed the dead brood. How hygienic were those bees? Were they finding brood issues and then ripping out the brood and cleaning out the problem? Hygienic bees are more likely to be able to resist Varroa. Other breeding programs, things like the UBO selection program, are also based on this hygienic uncapping and brood removal behavior of bees. And so if we've got a colony that has a high level of mites, the queen might be laying egg after egg after egg after egg. The bees might all be growing up, but if some of them are getting infested with mites, then we can't evaluate the quality of the brood pattern because all of those little gaps that we see might not be the queen doing a crummy job of laying. It might actually be the bees doing a magnificent job of sniffing out the cells that had Varroa inside, opening them up, and then removing the pupae as a way to disrupt parasite reproduction. So if you don't know the mite level of a colony, if you're not doing that monthly sampling, then you can't really evaluate your brood pattern with any confidence. And so I don't want you to pinch all of the queens that have a couple of holes here and there in their brood patterns, thinking that you're trying to get better and better queens, when in reality what you're doing is killing the most mite-resistant bees in your operation. Last point I want to cover here is whether or not you should be doing a summer honey harvest. And it is a judgment call, and I can't give you any absolute rules on whether this is a good or a bad idea for you to pursue. The age and the size of the colony is going to matter a lot. First-year colonies generally are not going to be able to spare any of their summer honey, right? They're just getting established. Any honey that they've been able to pack away, they're going to need going into the next couple of months during lean periods, rainy periods, hot periods when no flowers are blooming. You can harvest a colony's honey throughout the summer, but you're going to have to feed that colony in fall. And if you do anything wrong, if you go on a long vacation in midsummer when the colony doesn't have any reserves, you can't refill the feeders, you could wind up with a colony that dies. You can also just wait and harvest all of your honey at the end of the summer before the fall finishes, or maybe even in the, after the fall flow has happened, and figure out how much honey the bees have made, and then judiciously calculate how much you're going to leave behind. There is an issue, though, if you want to wait to harvest once a year. All of these colonies are managed under a regimen where they're harvested once annually. And as you can see, there's a whole heck of a lot of boxes on these colonies. They're very, very tall. I'm 6 feet tall, and I'm not terribly excited about going into a 7 or 8 or 9-story tall colony, pulling off all of that honey so I can go down and do my brood manipulations. So there can be an advantage to pulling that capped honey and harvesting it earlier in the year, especially if it's clear that a colony has been very productive. Overwintered colonies are more likely to be able to spare their honey. They might come into the spring with some honey left over from winter. They might be able to capitalize on spring flowers a little bit more aggressively, but other overwintered colonies can't. There's not an absolute rule that says that second-year colonies can spare summer honey. And as one case study, I'll give you an example of a colony we had at Betterbee where the colony swarmed in early July after spring or a summer honey harvest had been made. Then there was a week of rain where they couldn't regrow and rebuild anything. So the swarm takes a bunch of honey. There's a week of rain. No new food is coming in. Then the summer dearth began. It was a particularly dry year and a long dearth. That colony starved to death, even though they had been otherwise set up for success, because they just didn't have enough honey to maintain brood production and to keep the bees alive until the next big bloom took place. So how should you decide whether or not to harvest your summer honey? Well, first, you need to figure out when the bees in your region and in your specific area around your apiary are actually making honey, right? Which months of the year is your colony going to be able to spare a super or even a frame of honey? And in which years are they unlikely to get very much honey? If your bees are making honey in April and May and August and September, but they've got nothing coming in for June and July, you can take some April-May honey, but you certainly want to leave them enough to get through until August, right? At the same time, if your bees are more or less continuously getting a little bit of this and a little bit of that, you might have more flexibility about what you're able to harvest. So you need to understand your particular flows, and you need to think like a honeybee. If there's been really good weather this season, if the right flowers have been blooming, if the colonies really seem like they're doing well, yes, you can take some honey. If the colonies seem like they're struggling, just because you took honey last year doesn't mean you can take it this year. But there are real advantages to summer honey. Summer honey allows you to harvest varietal honeys. So when you're pulling your honey multiple times per year, one strategy you can use is to put supers on your colonies right before a particular flower in the area blooms. On the left, we've got a bee visiting an orange blossom. In the upper right, we've got basswood, which produces lovely basswood honey, one of my favorites. And then in the lower right, we have Japanese knotweed, which produces what beekeepers often market as bamboo honey, even though it's not really bamboo. And it has a very distinct and potent flavor. It's a specific varietal that you can harvest. If you're able to do this, if you can figure out that a particular tree is blooming in a particular area, and then you can get supers on and pull them off at just the right time, you can justifiably say this is basswood honey or orange blossom honey. If you can't do that, that doesn't mean that you can't produce different varieties of honey. So right here, we've got images of different honeys that have been harvested all from the same hive during the same year. But they were harvested at different times and therefore have very different flavors. The flowers that contributed to the honey on the left in the lower right-hand image here are very different than the flowers that contributed to the honey on the right, because different things were blooming during the time that those cells were getting filled up. This can be a really good strategy if you are trying to sell your honey at, let's say, a farmer's market. Because if you show up and you've got boxes and boxes of identical honey, people will come up, they'll chat with you, and they might buy a jar of honey. But if you've got more than one variety, particularly if you let people taste some and you say, oh yeah, this was my spring honey, and this was my early summer honey, and this was my late summer honey, and here's my fall honey, now suddenly they're getting this experience, they're understanding the differences in the honey, and they might say, wow, you know what, I really liked your midsummer stuff. I want to get some of that. Or you know what, I think my husband would like this fall honey, so now I'm going to buy some of that for him. Very quickly, you're able to get a lot of interest in multiple jars of your honey at the stand just by taking it at different times and not mixing the bee's productivity for the year together. So if you're going to harvest that summer honey, what do you want to do? Well, you don't want to harvest any nectar. Nectar has too much moisture in it. Until the bees cap it, it is going to ferment if you extract it and put it in a jar. This looks pretty good. At the top, it's got capped, cells that are full of honey, but down below, that's still nectar. So you're not going to be able to harvest this frame. It's going to dilute the honey that you're harvesting too much. This is a frame that has a lot of capped honey. It does still have some open nectar in the upper left-hand corner. If every one of my frames looked like this, I would be really worried about the water concentration when I'm harvesting my honey. If most of my frames are completely capped and then one of my frames look like this, I'm not going to stress about it too much, because generally the bees will overshoot that dehydration process just a little bit. So I can get a little bit of this stuff. I would still want to make sure that that wasn't really, really runny. It wasn't brand new nectar that was harvested today. I want to make sure that this is stuff that's, most of the way dried down into being ripe honey. And then maybe I'll allow myself to harvest a couple of frames that look like this. But by and large, what I'm looking for is completely capped frames. How do you get your bees off of the frames if you're harvesting summer honey? Well, a lot of beekeepers in the fall like to use the triangle escape board over here on the left. This is a very clever contraption that is essentially a one-way valve for bees. You put it with the triangle facing downwards on top of your brood nest underneath your honey supers. On a cool, evening, all of the bees up in the supers will pile down into the brood nest to keep everything warm. And then in the morning, when they go up to visit the supers again, they can't figure out how to get through this screen. They can't figure out how to navigate the triangle. So now the colony is going to be unable to get back up there. You can pull the supers and bring them in for harvest. In the summer, however, it is not terribly cold, even at the nighttime. And so this isn't maybe going to be your best strategy. Instead, you're probably going to have the most success if you are using something like we can see on the right, a fume board, a piece of cloth with this shim wrapped around it and maybe a metal backing on it that you can spray some bee repellent chemical onto. The most potent of those is Bee Go, which is a butyric acid product. Butyric acid is also very, very stinky. It's the thing that makes vomit smell just like vomit. And so it's not something you want to be getting on your skin or on your clothing or spilling in your garage. So if you use this, you can drive the bees out of the supers, quickly pull the supers off, take them off for harvesting, and the bees and the honey won't be harmed by those butyric acid fumes. They'll all evaporate away. However, if you don't want to deal with butyric acid, there are other products, things like Fisher's Bee Quick, which do something similar, but they smell much more pleasant to the human nose, still as unpleasant to the bee nose. So you may try something like that if you don't want to deal with this product. But this is a way that you can get a lot of bees out of supers very quickly during the summer. It is also entirely possible that you'll just go to your supers, take a frame, shake the bees off of it, brush the bees off of it, tuck it into a nuke box, and carry that into your honey house for harvesting. If you're getting just a small amount of summer honey, you can do it manually and in that much slower way. If you do choose to harvest in the summer, what are you going to be doing? Well, first of all, do it indoors. I can't tell you how many TikTok and YouTube videos I've seen where folks are eagerly trying to show off their great bee productivity and setting up their extractor out on their porch in lovely sunny weather. And it seems like a really nice idea to sit there and spin that honey until you open up the valve at the bottom of the extractor and all the bees in the neighborhood pour in to try to steal it. So you want to make sure you're in as close to a bee-proof space as possible. You need to make sure that once you get the bees off of your combs, no matter what strategy you use to do that, you're extracting that honey within 2 days. And the reason is that small hive beetles are able to hatch, their eggs are able to hatch, and larvae are able to start causing trouble and fermenting honey under ideal moisture conditions, just 2 days. And so it's very, very important that if the bees aren't there to be patrolling, gobbling up beetle larvae and beetle eggs, that you're able to get those bees, get that honey extracted very quickly. You want to spin the honey out, or you need to completely crush your combs, right? You're not going to be able to scrape the cappings off of the frame and then set it down on a cookie sheet. That's a thing that a lot of new beekeepers are tempted to try. Oh, I'm just going to do one. I don't want to dirty up the extractor. Well, bees don't want gravity to pull all of that honey out of their cells. So they've done a pretty darn good job of making it very, very viscous and having it stick up into those cells. You need the speed of a spinning honey extractor to really get that honey thrown out. The wax cappings that you remove from those colonies, you're also going to need to take care of. You either have to render them down into a block of beeswax, killing any wax moth eggs that might have been laid on them, or you need to freeze them, again, to kill the wax moth eggs so that you can then render them and process them at some later point. But you don't want to leave a bucket full of honey-covered wax sitting in your basement. You are very likely to come in and find wax moths devouring that wax when you go in a couple of weeks later. And finally, when you harvest your honey, you want to let it settle for at least 3 days. And that's because as you're extracting that honey, bubbles are going to form. Air is going to be added to the honey as it is spinning through an extractor like this. So that air that the honey accumulates and that sort of gets trapped up inside of it is going to create a very unpleasant foam if you bottle the honey up right away. And so people aren't really going to want to buy any more of your honey. Far better is to put it into a bucket or into a holding tank, leave it for a few days, let all the bubbles rise to the surface, and they'll carry with them little bits of protein and other detritus, maybe a bee leg here and there that shouldn't really be down in that honey anyway. When that all floats up to the top, you can skim it off, and then you can bottle out of the bottom of that bucket or that tank and produce a very, very high quality summer honey. It is a really great treat to get to harvest and eat summer honey, but discretion is the better part of beekeeping. And I don't want you to make the mistake of trying to harvest this honey and then, struggling to keep your colonies alive because a long, dry summer period emerges and the bees aren't able to survive without the honey that you've taken from them. So you need to be prepared to backfeed sugar syrup in the event that you go in and start monkeying with the bees' food storage. So this is what we've covered today. You need to be inspecting your colonies regularly all summer. You need to give them more space when they need it. Keep your mites under control. Make sure that your queen is good. And if she isn't, you need to do that replacement cycle during the summer so that if something goes wrong, you can then correct whatever went wrong because you simply don't have the time for the rest of the year. And you may or you may not decide to harvest some summer honey. And that's really up to you and up to your bees and up to the weather around them. Summer beekeeping isn't actually that hard. It's a lot of the hard work of beekeeping happens in the summer, but it's not that complicated. As long as you're checking the bees regularly, responding to their needs, giving them space, keeping the mites and the queen the way they should be, you generally don't have that much to worry about. If you'd like to learn more, if you've enjoyed this, Betterbee does have both in-person classes at our location here in Greenwich and online classes. A number of these classes have both versions. So if you click into them on our website, you can jump in and sign up to take any of a number of these courses. The Seasons of Beekeeping webinars this year are going to be free, and so I do encourage you to go in and sign up for the fall and the winter webinars that are already up there on the website. If you do that, it's going to give us a sense of how many people will be in them. And obviously, as long as the recording works, we'll be able to post the recording with the full Q&A session up on YouTube. I do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is really, really one of the best avenues that we have to get you up-to-date, important, exciting, accurate beekeeping information. And so please subscribe to it, and it lets us justify to Betterbee why we're continuing to make all of this great content. And then if you are watching this in early 2026, I will tell you that we do still have bee packages available for sale for pickup here at Betterbee. We've got both normal 3-pound packages, and for the first time, we are offering 4-pound packages as well, which is pretty cool. It's a supercharged package that's going to give your colony a jump start growing into the season, since they're going to be getting started a little later. Those are only available on our 3rd load of packages, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we've got a spring sale going on. Again, if you're watching this around the time the video goes up, a bunch of different things are on sale. You can just go to betterbee.com and click on the sale button in the upper right-hand corner. There's a number of different things that are discounted, colored jackets and candle molds and things like that. But there's one that I do want to draw your attention to, because I twisted some arms and I convinced Betterbee to put this book on sale. This is a book about Tropolaelaps mites, and this is the new devastating parasitic mite, other than Varroa, that beekeepers are dealing with in Asia and in Eastern Europe, and potentially creeping into Central Europe, and then, who knows, thereafter, Western Europe and maybe even the United States. So this is the most cutting-edge, understandable but scientifically grounded explanation of what we currently know about these mites. And so if you'd like to read that, the book is on sale right now, and I encourage you to jump in, go to the sale page, and then you should be able to click over and find it. So it has been a great pleasure spending time with you. Normally, I would do a Q&A, but unfortunately, I'm not able to do it because of the webinar screw-up. So if you've got any questions, just post them down here underneath this YouTube video, and we will be very happy to watch them as they come in, and then I'll try to answer them. Maybe someone else on our team will chime in too. If you have any other questions, you can always call Betterbee, email us, come visit us right here. And if you want to send an email and get a guaranteed response, you can send it to support@betterbee.com, and our team is always happy to answer questions that way as well. With that, thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope this was interesting. I hope you feel like it was valuable. And I hope that you'll join us for some of our upcoming Seasons of Beekeeping webinars after you have a spectacularly successful summer with your bees. Thanks very much.